Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner, and I'm going to be joined here by my co-host, Taylor. Let's go ahead and bring him in. How's it going, Taylor?
Pretty good. Feels good to be doing this at the normal time, the normal place. All feels right with the world. We're both going to go see the vampire movie later that we've been tweeting about a lot. It's a good day.
Yeah, we're both going to see Last Voyage of the Demeter separately.
Yeah, not together.
We're in different states. We could cause a lot of Twitter discourse and have a video call going as we're both simultaneously watching the movie in theaters. Challenge people to tell us that we're not allowed to do that. But yeah, I'm excited for it. I really love the concept of it. It kind of straddles the line between just remaking an existing, I don't want to say franchise, because, I feel like Dracula deserves more respect than that. But it kind of treads the line between a remake and something new, taking this relatively small chapter of Dracula and expanding it out into a feature film. I think is really cool.
I think that's where the interesting tidbits lie in a property like Dracula. There's not that many interesting ways to have Dracula be in a castle in Romania or whatever. Mm-hmm. That's been done. But to put him on a ship in the middle of the ocean and have that environment, you're basically doing Alien, but with Dracula. That's kind of a fun idea.
It's kind of the similar appeal to what we have talked about before with historical fiction of finding a gap in an established story and filling it with something new or interesting, something that logically is happening within the confines of the story, and just doing the same thing, but here with fiction.
It's basically the way the entire Star Wars franchise functions nowadays.
I haven't kept up on those. Although now that we have Disney Plus, I could be checking out.
I have had ample opportunity to, and just never can muster up the will to be I am going to invest my time in learning what happened here. They're fine. I don't have any ill will towards it or anything, but I just never want to invest the time.
I was most into Star Wars when I was a kid, and I never even watched the newest of the prequel movies, Revenge of the Sith. I remember when it came out as a kid and just no longer really being interested.
I don't think I've seen that. Is that episode 3? I haven't seen that either. I've seen 1 and 2.
And it's not that I didn't like the first ones. I was the perfect age to enjoy Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. So yeah, I just kind of lost interest in it. But at some point, I'll probably check out The Mandalorian. And I know there's a few others that people have said are really good, just as shows or as movies rather than, as a Star Wars thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, at least then you could just binge the whole thing and not have to wait for new seasons to come out. This is an impromptu media check-in. I like it.
Basically. What else have you been up to?
Oh, what else? I've been listening to a lot of music still. Stephanie Joyce has been on my playlist a lot. She's kind of a new country artist. A lot of kind of darker stuff, kind of dark humored stuff. I don't know. It's not what you think of, when you think of modern country, I would say.
It's not Richmond, north of Richmond.
No, it's not. So it's fun. I've been enjoying her stuff. Her song Resurrection Day is fairly new. It's fun. It's not what the title makes it seem like it's about. It's definitely interesting. Other thing is I'm continuing to plow through King of the Hill, which unfortunately is topical as Johnny Hartwick passed away, who was the voice of Dale Gribble, who kind of makes the show what it is. I feel like Dale Gribble is an essential part of King of the Hill working.
He is such a good blend of the absurdist humor. A lot of that comes from Dale in the show, but also a lot of the really sweet moments on the show also come from Dale. So I think those kind of the two fun parts of King of the Hill that make it a good show are really sort of wrapped up in Dale's character.
It's time for John Redcorn to step up. It's also interesting just with kind of realizing, part of it is that show is when did it end in 2010? It's an old show, but a lot of people from that show have passed away between Tom Petty, Brittany Murphy, and now Johnny Hartwick. I don't know. It's interesting.
I think just the way that your words came out there, it made me imagine a person of just the right age to be Tom Petty died. Tom Petty from King of the Hill.
as the worst character in all of King of the Hill.
He's not a popular character there.
I hate that character so much, but Tom Petty does a great job playing it.
I don't know why I still follow the King of the Hill subreddit, but I do. That's most subreddits, honestly. I don't know why I still follow this, but it's funny in there because it's just like the rampant posting about it's like, well, I think Peggy was a really bad character in this episode. I think Peggy was really mean here. And it's like, yes, that is the show. That is the point of Peggy's character, is she does stuff that you don't like. This is what a television show is.
That's like most of the posts in the Office subreddit as well, where everyone's like, Jim was not nice to Pam in episode 8 of season 10. And it's like, yeah, it's called the premise of the show. It's why there's a problem to solve this episode.
Media literacy, all-time high. I've still been reading How the Word Is Passed by Clint Smith. I think I mentioned it on a previous check-in. I just finished his chapter on Galveston Island.
Just can't escape Galveston.
That one tied up with the Juneteenth holiday and kind of the history of it and sort of the story versus the reality. That book's interesting because and several times he talks with Civil War reenactors. Obviously, Civil War reenactors, some of them are going to be reenacting the Confederacy. And, you know, he does a good job of talking with and sharing equal opportunity. You know, people, you know, what motivates you to cosplay the Confederacy, you know, this. And yeah, I mean, the responses are what you'd expect. You know, people saying, well, it wasn't about slavery, or, you know, it was about freedom, or, you know, it was just them defending themselves. If the North had never invaded, then nothing would have ever happened. And, you know, and I think Clint Smith as a Black author and researcher, he is in a very good spot to hear those things and kind of be able to put them in perspective of, okay, well, what about the millions of slaves? If quote, nothing had ever happened, what's going on there? What's going to happen with them?
Well, I think it's interesting too that like there's an argument you can make that there's nothing wrong with dressing up and reenacting Confederate stuff, because like you have to have that to have a full reenactment, right? Like you've got to have both sides, I guess.
I thought you were going to say there's an argument to be made. There's nothing wrong with slavery.
No, it's more like, what do you do in your free time? What you doing in your free time with the Confederate stuff? Because that's, you know, like if you're just into the history and learning, and it's like, okay, now we go out and show what happened. Like that would be the education part that everyone likes to claim they're doing. But it's like, no, if you're still just really into it in your free time and all you collect is Confederate stuff, like we're moving past the heritage piece.
It's a team building exercise for the State Patrol. So reading through that's been interesting. A lot of it's obviously really dark history. That's just the premise of the book. But I think Clint Smith does a good job of sort of framing things in a way that shows kind of the imperfect progress that's been made. And then also being realistic about historical figures like, you know, Abraham Lincoln and how unsatisfied other abolitionists were with him throughout his time. You know, people like Frederick Douglass having to basically call him out and say, well, this isn't what we want or what we need. And then also, you know, the idea that, you know, people like to point out, well, it was like, well, Lincoln's views on Black Americans were not very good. And it's like, no, they weren't, but they were clearly showing a trajectory of evolution. And the fact that he's assassinated so early in his second term, it's kind of an open question. You know, does that develop further? Who knows, really? But he kind of goes at a lot of those kind of, you know, classic gotcha things that you might hear from a lost causer. And yeah, I think he handles it really well. He deals with some difficult topics that are, you know, probably even more difficult for him to be handling in person. Yeah, so it's a really interesting.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, we have a fun episode here. This is going to be a pretty special episode. It's going to be a 2-part episode because in addition to the story we're going to cover today, we are going to talk to a guest with a really unique connection to this shipwreck. And that's going to be in part 2 of the episode that we'll record next week. I'll say a little bit more about that at the end, getting into what would normally be the aftermath section of a wreck. We are discussing a vessel called the Santo Cristo de Burgos. This is a Spanish Manila galleon from the late 1600s.
What does Manila galleon mean?
This is the kind of ship that we talked about with the San Felipe incident. Just a term for galleons sailing from Manila in the Philippines across the Pacific to Acapulco in Mexico. I'll get more into that trade route. I have quite a bit more about that in this episode. But that's what we mean. We mean these big, heavily loaded, you wouldn't quite call them treasure ships, but they're loaded with goods from Asia to be distributed out through the rest of the Spanish Empire.
If you were making a TV show, you would call them treasure ships.
At least going from west to east, they're not loaded up with gold and silver, but coming back, that's exactly what they're carrying. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So this episode, we're going to be calling back on some of that previous knowledge of these Manila galleons that we first discussed in that episode on the San Felipe. In that one, we had a galleon wrecking in Japan, and that led us ultimately to a discussion of the 26 martyrs of Japan. Check out that episode for more.
Yeah, that was one of those that was just such a weird time in history, weird time and place to be talking about.
Yeah, in that episode, we discussed the timing and the routes of ships sailing from Manila in the Philippines to Acapulco in Mexico, or New Spain, we could call it. The San Felipe story took place about 100 years before this one. But like so many things in the Spanish Empire, very little had changed in that time. That's not always a positive when you're trying to govern a global empire. You want to be updating things sometimes. So galleons would depart from the Philippines, and they would enter the North Pacific Gyre, which would take them north, then east across the Pacific, roughly at the latitude of like Northern California. Then they would follow the west coast of North America down to their destination in Mexico. And the Manila galleon trade was really an essential piece of how Spain's global empire functioned, bringing those goods from East Asia, most importantly China, but other places too. That would go first to Mexico, and then much of that would go on to Europe.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've not thought about really like the supply chain and logistics behind the Philippines being a Spanish colony.
Mm-hmm.
But that is interesting that it has to flow through Mexico.
Yeah, and throughout this, I mean, from a logistics standpoint, this is a fascinating time because this is a lot of stuff being moved around. And by and large, the cargo and the people involved are all recorded in painstaking detail. So for something that is so old, we're talking 300, 400, 500 years ago with some of these things. And just the level of detail that went into this. We talked about that when we talked about the Archivo General de Indias in a previous episode. So yeah, there's records of all this stuff. It's pretty amazing. Throughout this, I'm going to be quoting quite a bit from it's a special edition that was put out of the Oregon Historical Quarterly in 2018. And every article or most articles in that relate to this one particular Santo Cristo de Burgos, sometimes referred to as the Beeswax Wreck, for reasons we'll talk about. So in one of those articles, in Views Across the Pacific, Cameron Follette and Douglas Deur, I hope I'm pronouncing both of those right, they see the Manila trade as the ultimate goal of Spanish empire building.
In many respects, the successful establishment of the Acapulco to Manila trade in the 16th century can be seen as a realization of the commercial ambitions and westward reach of Columbus and his sponsors, who had expected to find a sea route to China 3/4 of a century before.
Yeah, that provides an interesting look at this, because I think I would say at very least for Americans, when we think of the Spanish Empire, we think of them coming to the Americas, digging up gold and silver, and sending it back to Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big part of it, obviously, and how that allowed them to finance the things that they needed to finance. But we kind of forget about the ultimate goal of why they were sending people west in the first place. What was Columbus looking for? He wanted to trade with China. And so this the Manila galleon trade, this is the ultimate realization of what they actually wanted.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that this is still early, so that is the goal. I feel like that probably shifts as the Spanish Empire matures and they realize that South America is really going to be their piggy bank. But at this point, yeah, I feel like China's still the goal.
So Spain's first contact with the Philippines came during Magellan's famous voyage around the world. Magellan, Portuguese, but sailing for Spain.
Also, that is hilarious. That's kind of funny to me that back in the day, Columbus, just an Italian dude who's you're Spanish now, go. It's just funny how that worked.
I actually just got to that part in Lords of the Horizons about the Ottoman Empire and how them basically taking all of Genoa's property in the Mediterranean left a lot of Genoese sailors with nothing to do.
Yeah, I found that really interesting in that Ottoman book that I read. I did not realize that Genoa and the Ottomans had such a interesting relationship.
Yeah, so leading to stuff like, hey, Columbus is trying to find places to peddle his wares.
Also interesting that like Italy as a concept doesn't exist for a lot of that time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like regional powers.
And you know what? Maybe things were better that way.
Break up Germany, break up Italy.
That's the stance of the podcast.
That's the stance of Britain in about 1939.
Break up all European nations into their constituent historical pieces. Bring back Wessex and Mercia and East Anglia.
I want to hear your plan for the Balkans.
Independent Valencia, Catalonia, Basque country.
City-states everywhere.
I think there's a group that also wants an independent Basque country. Maybe we can get in contact with them. Although I think they ceased operations recently. So anyway, speaking of dead Spaniards, very famously, the Philippines not kind to Magellan and his men. Magellan's killed in battle at Mactan in April of 1521. That voyage was finally completed under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, who returned to Spain in September 1522. So the overall voyage, they were able to circumnavigate the globe, leaving Magellan dead on the beach.
It's a tactical victory.
So despite Spain's less than ideal first experiences in the Philippines, later expeditions, they established a permanent colonial presence in the islands, starting in 1565 under Miguel Lopez de Legazpi. And Legazpi's navigator on this expedition was Andres de Urdaneta, and this is a name that becomes just inextricably linked with more than 2 centuries of this Manila galleon trade. They're establishing this presence in the Philippines, and those ships are coming, from New Spain. One of the first big hurdles that they have to sort of tackle is, how do we get back to Mexico? We don't want to sail around the world every time we do this.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get back? Because again, this is the days of everything is dependent on the wind, and no one has tried to do this before. No one's tried to sail the other way. And so Urdaneta is tasked with figuring this out, a way that they can do this. And so just based on his experience, Urdaneta guessed correctly that the Pacific winds moved in these big gyres. Now if you look at a map, you can see the North Pacific and the South Pacific gyre. And so this was kind of his theory that he wanted to test out. And so he guessed that if you sail north from the Philippines, eventually you'll hit the westerly winds that'll take you east across the Pacific.
Interesting.
And he demonstrated this with the ship San Pablo, and he arrived back in Acapulco in September of 1565. And this is the exact route that these Spanish galleons are going to follow. I mean, this is kind of the only way to do that.
I was going to say, I guess when you don't have a choice, like this becomes their own.
And so on arrival in Acapulco, goods are then transferred, wherever they need to go. Some of those go overland to other parts of New Spain. Some get on other ships to Panama or Peru. And then some ultimately are bound for Spain, for European markets.
What an interesting time, though, to be around in the markets of, I won't call it Mexico. You have all these goods flowing from Asia through there. You've got goods flowing up from South America. There's got to be a lot of cultural exchange going on there that has to be really interesting, and all of it done with like Spain kind of producing all of it, like as far as like what becomes popular and what becomes standard. It's very interesting.
That whole chain, it's kind of interesting how stuff comes into Acapulco. A lot of that goes overland to like Veracruz, and then there it goes through the Caribbean to Havana, and then on to Spain. So yeah, a lot of these cities are popping up and really becoming these centers of trade. So yeah, you'd probably see a lot of interesting stuff coming through.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of it sourced ethically.
Probably none of it, with extra cruelty.
So a very important element in the Manila galleon routes was their departure time.
I remembered talking about this previously.
Yes. So if we remember from the San Felipe episode, King Philip III of Spain, he'd actually issued an order in 1620 mandating that ships depart from Manila no later than the last day of June.
It's just crazy to think that like if you don't do it by then, you are stuck until the next season.
You really are dependent on getting this stuff done in time. And if you can't, then it's better just to wait. So the San Felipe, they had ended up departing in July. They were sailing before that order had been issued, but again, the wind patterns were still the same. The King of Spain did not decide that that's how the winds would work. So they had left in July, and we saw how she was, she got hit by, according to her records, as many as 3 different storm systems. ultimately ending up shipwrecked at Tosa Bay on the Japanese main island of Shikoku. The trip to Acapulco from the Philippines, it could take anywhere from 5 to 8 months, depending on circumstances. So that's quite a window there. If you're in Acapulco expecting one of these galleons, you don't have a great time estimate.
I think that's something we take for granted nowadays with modern logistics and tracking and, the way that just-in-time, logistics works. I know from reading about the Essex and all the whaling stuff, like, you would start to, after you'd have a window of when you thought a ship would come back or show up, but you didn't really know.
Mm-hmm.
So, you wouldn't really worry until they were 3 or 4 weeks late. It's crazy to think that if you have a window of 5 to 8 months, you could be on month 6 and that vessel could have sunk and you'll never know it. You'll never even worry about it until another month or two. It is really interesting.
This trip to Acapulco, taking, this, if you did it super, super fast, maybe you could do it in 4 months, as many as 8. So you're thinking, if I'm in Acapulco, I could be expecting them anytime from June to October. Sometime they're going to show up here. And so these galleons would then return to the Philippines early the following year. So usually leaving in February or March for this return leg. The return leg, much easier.
Mm-hmm.
Took about 3 months.
Nice.
A lot more consistent on what you could expect on the return journey. Much more pleasant latitudes for those return trips. Our ship today, the Santo Cristo de Burgos, she had some turbulent final years in the last decade of the 17th century. So main source of information here is the Galleon's Final Journey, accounts of ship, crew, and passengers in the Colonial archives. This is by Follette, Deur, and Esther González, writing for that same Oregon Historical Quarterly issue. So in the summer of 1690, she departed the Philippines under the command of Francisco de Arcocha, bound for Acapulco. And I know we love this from the Armada episodes. A lot of politics, a lot of politicking going on here.
Nothing like some Spanish politics.
Politrix, as Pitbull might refer to it. So the trip eastward went smoothly, but on arrival in Mexico, Francisco de Arcocha was replaced as commander of the ship. We mentioned that very little had changed about the Spanish Empire in the century since the Armada sailed against England. Included in this is the way that ships were managed and how people were selected for positions of command. That is to say, it wasn't a skill thing.
Mm-hmm.
Ships are under the command of a general rather than, what we would call a captain or, an admiral or something. So it sounds a bit strange reading about these things. You read about galleon generals. The ship's master was actually second in command on his own ship, with the pilot being third. That was an issue we talked about in those encounters of, on the English side, with the Armada, the ship's captain, his word was the law, and it didn't matter who you were. Whereas on the Spanish side, the sailing elements were secondary or second-class citizens, basically, compared to the soldiers.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because I feel like in most scenarios in the maritime world, the master of the vessel is effectively God on that ship. That's the only way it works. You have to have someone who understands what's going on to make the final decisions.
And we talked about some of that mentality about how the Armada was never really intended to be a naval fighting force. The ships are a vehicle. They're a tool to get people where they need to go. Whereas on the English side, they're a weapon in and of themselves.
Right.
And so here we really have the same. And honestly, things have been working out pretty okay for Spain. So probably figuring, why change it? They're making their money. They're getting their gold and silver and their goods from Asia. No reason to reinvent the wheel here. Arcocha was replaced by Don Bernardo Iñiguez del Bayo, a captain of mounted cavalry in Mexico City. Yep. See. On the orders of New Spain's Viceroy Gaspar de la Cerda. So yeah, as we said, your experience matters almost not at all when it comes to these things. So the decision does appear to have been purely political, with the Viceroy wanting to get one of his own associates in command of the galleon. And I say the galleon, these Manila galleons, there was one that would sail each year, and then one that would sail back. So this is the galleon. So if you have one of your friends, one of your underlings as in command of this, you are in control of the entire operation.
Interesting. I feel like that's all the more reason why I want a naval guy in charge. If I only get one of these, I want the guy that knows what he's doing.
Yeah, you got to get it right. So Del Bio, the new general of the galleon, pretty representative of what we would think of as a Spanish noble from the late 1600s. He's in his late 40s. He's from a Basque family in Navarre.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually really common for anyone who's involved with the Spanish Armada, any of these ship commanders. We saw that with the Armada. A lot of these guys come from Basque country because of that area's historical association with sailing.
Interesting.
So becoming general of a galleon, this wasn't something that you just got given. This often cost the candidate as much as 10,000 pesos. So you needed some spending money if you wanted this position. You could expect to make a good amount back in command of these things, but you needed some upfronts. You needed a little down payment first.
It's sort of like a MLM. You got to buy your way in.
So Del Bio had arrived in New Spain several years prior, and from 1687 to 1690, he'd served as mayor of San Luis de Potosí, a mining town in Mexico.
I am somewhat jealous of basically any point in history before like World War II, where you could just be a cavalry commander / mayor / admiral / you know what I mean? Like you could just go from like thing to thing and be like, I am this now. Like you can't do that nowadays. I don't feel like.
It's on record. Taylor wishes that he had been a conquistador.
I just want to Forrest Gump my way through history, apparently.
So a note there about this town that he's mayor of. I was confused by this at first when I read it. This is not to be confused with the far more famous and prosperous town of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia.
Uh-huh.
That's not what we're talking about. He was in charge of a successful mining town, but not that one. Not that Potosí. And while we're on the topic of Del Bio, we can connect something else back to the Armada episodes. In discussing the Armada commanders, several times we mentioned the Order of Santiago, of which many of those were members. A lot of the portraits we shared, you can see them wearing the Cross of Santiago. In the Galleon's final journey, the authors go into some detail about the order.
Del Bio was a knight in the Order of Santiago, an elite military Catholic order open only to those men able to prove 4 generations of nobility by blood and descent, not those who were granted nobility by monarchs. Applicants had to be of old Christian heritage without Moorish, Jewish, or Converso blood, and sons of parents in legal matrimony. In order to become a Knight of Santiago, applicants had to provide many witnesses, also not of Jewish, Converso, or Moorish blood, testifying to these and other matters. Del Bio provided 30, as well as extracts from his father's and grandparents' wills.
Yeah, so all of this gives us an idea of what kind of person you had to be to get into this position of general of a Manila galleon.
This is like joining the SS.
It's very much like this isn't even something that you could, like, buying your way into it was a necessary but not sufficient condition. Money wasn't enough. You needed the pedigree.
I guess this is how you keep the new money out, right? Like you can say you can have all the money, but you're still not one of us. Like we're the most special boys.
Exactly. And from that quote, they mentioned the term converso. Converso is just a term in Spanish for Jews who converted to Catholicism.
When the Spanish people asked all the Jewish people nicely to convert.
Yeah, and so as you can see here, like that in itself it didn't elevate your status all that much, because you could say, well, we're Christian now, but if your grandparents were Jews, it still barred you from a lot of opportunities.
That's an interesting contrast to a lot of the Ottoman stuff I was reading, where like once you converted, like you're pretty much good to go.
I forget which sultan it was, one of the Bayazids, but when the Jews had been expelled from Spain, that's where a lot of them ended up. And he basically said, well, it must be a very foolish king who would impoverish his own country to enrich mine. Saying, yeah, like, come on in. Like we can, as long as you want to pay your taxes and you've got skills to share, we're happy to have you.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Like the differences in how like people like that are viewed.
Yeah, another interesting line from that was talk about the Ottoman expansion of, the sultans wanted taxpayers, not Muslims. But the idea of like, yeah, it doesn't really matter. Just give us our money and, don't act up.
We want to be clear, we are not a pro-Ottoman Empire podcast. There's plenty of bad things, too.
There's some bad stuff. So in addition to replacing the general in charge, the Viceroy de la Cerda, he also ordered the replacement of the sergeant major, the boatswain, and the ship's master.
So literally everyone that is in charge of anything?
So this caused some discontent among the crew, and it took people by surprise on both sides of the Pacific. Just this, pretty bold, very out in the open, just like political replacement of these people.
Yeah, this very much feels like when upper management has some new ideas about how to freshen things up a little bit, and everyone's just like, no, thank you. Just let me do my work.
So the Santo Cristo de Burgos, under her new command, arrived back in Manila in July of 1691. The return leg of these trips, like I mentioned before, this is massively, enormously important for the Spanish holdings in the Philippines, because this carries the crown subsidy for the colony. In this case, this is 131,504 pesos for the maintenance of the colony, and an additional 24,023 pesos for the church in the Philippines. So this is just a ship full of money. This is, gold and silver to keep things running. This is what keeps Spain's Philippine operations in operation. And really, any interruption to this galleon trade, this was devastating to the economy in the Philippines.
July's got to be like the worst time to arrive, though, right?
I believe on the southern route, this was much better.
Okay.
Because
I guess I just meant like as far as like you can't leave, right? Like you're stuck.
But yeah, they are arriving in July. You're not going to sail again that year. Kind of more or less regardless. And so the vessel goes through an overhaul to prepare for her next sailing season, which would be 1692. So let's go to 1692, all the way to June of 1692.
Okay.
So now timing does become a factor. We see it's taken almost a year to get refitted and ready to go. June is kind of our target month here. Santo Cristo de Burgos departed Cavite, which is near Manila, loaded with trade goods for Acapulco. Total cargo value estimate of 256,666 pesos. And she leaves on June 30th, also known as the latest possible day to fall within that safe window. Really cutting corners here.
Seems like it.
Really finishing your math homework right before the bell rings here.
Hey, let me see yours. I'll change my answers a little bit.
And she leaves Manila. She reaches the San Bernardino Straits, separating the Philippine island of Luzon, that's where Manila is, from the smaller island of Samar on September 14th. So this is not an enormous distance to cover in that time. Just based on a quick estimate, I was just using the Google Map distance tracker, covering a distance of a little over 300 miles in about 2.5 months. And this put her in the Straits much later than was typical for a galleon. She's kind of behind schedule this whole time.
Yeah, it's like a real Donner Party kind of progression here.
So upon reaching the Straits themselves, things don't get easier. So quoting from Follette and Deur, who described the San Bernardino Straits, which is also known as the Embocadero, it's kind of a contemporary term for it, they describe it as follows.
A treacherous maze of shifting tides, heavy currents, invisible shoals, and low-lying islands subject to seething waves, vicious squalls, and thick fogs. It often took the Manila galleons a month or longer just to clear the Embocadero, and many were lost in this region.
All right, so not a fun time. They're delayed. They get to, they finally get to the Straits that are a known issue. They do make it through the Straits. But on November 7th, as the Santo Cristo de Burgos is attempting to make her way into the Pacific, she's caught in a heavy gale. She loses all 3 of her masts, and she's forced back to the island of Luzon, where she puts into Naga Bay on the eastern side of the island on December 18th. So this is why you don't wait until June 30th. The commander, Del Bio, he reported the setback as follows.
Having reached the Marianas on 15 October at 24 degrees with unfavorable winds and much work, We encountered a northeasterly wind that set us back to 30 degrees. In that position, without squalls and with a choppy sea. We checked the foremast in the morning of 7 November and ordered it to be cut. This did not happen, and it fell to the port side and broke the mainstay. And as the mainstay was also badly damaged, it fell onto the mizzen. And they were smashed to pieces, along with the main yardarm, topmast, sails, and all the rigging. In 13 days, we were able to rig up provisional sails, and I decided to continue the voyage to New Spain. But the headwinds, and having been forced south to 25 degrees, reluctantly, I called a committee, and we decided to land.
This is one where we talk about the pressures on a captain or on the commander of a vessel.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, yes, it does seem extremely logical. Like, why would you continue sailing into this? You've lost all your masts. You have this jerry-rigged system that you're going to try and sail across the Pacific in. Why wouldn't you turn around? And on the other hand, this is a pretty enormous decision he's making here. Because like we said, this is the galleon. This is the thing that keeps the economies of New Spain and the Philippines functioning.
I guess it doesn't matter if you sink or don't make it. Like, the outcome is almost the same as far as like what happens to the economy. And that's the part that you're going to be held accountable for. So like, yeah, like you go.
Yeah. So like it does make sense. We talk about the pressures on these captains, the economic pressure on these captains a lot. And this is a great example of, this is a big decision that you're not going to make lightly, because, I mean, this is still at the time where if you make a big enough mistake, you could just get beheaded.
Think about how much pressure you have to show up to your job at Target unloading trucks when you feel sick.
Mm-hmm.
And now, like, put the entire Spanish Empire's economy on your shoulders, and like, you're going to figure it out.
Yeah. So like, on the one hand, like there's valid pressures on both sides here. I'm not validating the Spanish Empire. I'm just saying that it makes sense. So while the vessel likely would have taken any safe harbor they could get to, the problem now is that Naga Bay really just has basic shipbuilding facilities.
Mm-hmm.
The island of Luzon is very interestingly shaped. And so while it is on the same island as, you know, their main facilities, it's a good distance away, and it's hard to get to.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have the availability of like the full arsenal that they'd have at Cavite. And if they're going to do repairs in Naga Bay, what about all the cargo? Or is it just going to sit on the ship while we do this? Are we going to offload it and try to do something else with it? So this was a big question.
All the traders in this committee, having heard the agreements, they said that the trade goods in the galleon should be unloaded in the harbor in question, and some huts should be made to hold all the cargo of the galleon, so that when the weather permitted the journey to New Spain, it could be loaded again.
So blame for the incident fell on the ship's pilot, or the third in command, Juan Quintero.
Oh, cool. Just high enough to be held accountable, but low enough to have people above him to blame him.
So the investigation also found that the foremast had been improperly installed, and that the sails were too large for the masts and rigging. Del Bayo accused Quintero of being drunk and inept, changing the sailing route without reason, and being too cautious in urging them to turn back before they exited the San Bernardino Strait. Seems like a good idea in retrospect.
It's just funny that he was drunk and inept, but also like did the thing that you should have done, which is turn around.
So in turn, the pilot, Quintero, blamed the bosun, Pedro Flores. I don't know if he's related to our Flores from the Armada, for using ropes that were not strong enough for the rigging and not tightening the ropes sufficiently.
The blame is just rolling downhill. I love it.
And Quintero did testify like, hey, you know, I do drink occasionally, but never enough to like lose my senses, and never when I'm doing my job.
What is the Spanish drink of choice? Is it wine?
A lot of wine. I'm sure they were drinking something harder too, but Del Bayo was not found guilty of any misconduct that resulted in the failed voyage. So, you know, makes sense.
Here's another 10,000 pesos to make that problem go away.
Juan Quintero, he was stripped of his position as galleon pilot and exiled from the Philippines. The bosun, Pedro Flores, was also held responsible for his role in the events, and he kind of gets railroaded here. He was just a pilot's assistant, and so the bosun here is the one responsible for all of the rigging and the sails. That wasn't his job. he was only serving as bosun after the death of Lorenzo Hernandez, who was the ship's real bosun. So Flores also is no longer allowed to serve on board galleons, and he's banished from Manila for 10 years, in addition to having his personal assets seized to pay for some of the expenses of the voyage.
Wow.
I guess shades of what we talked about with the trenchant, the British submarine with the fishing boat that they impacted, and how the blame for whatever reason fell on the person who was literally in training with several superior officers overseeing him at the time. And so, yeah, you kind of have to sympathize a little bit with, well, maybe this person wasn't the person responsible for this.
Yeah, like I think if you've done any sort of management or training of someone, you realize pretty quick that like even if they're the cause of the problem, like it's not their fault. It's definitely on the person training them to let it get to that point.
This also highlights the interesting position that these galleon commanders are in, because while they can have the position and, you know, the status of, well, I'm a galleon commander, as soon as something goes wrong with the ship, they can say, well, I'm not a sailor. I didn't do this. I don't know what I'm looking at here. Into the section labeled the incident. Santo Cristo de Burgos underwent extensive repairs at Naga Bay through the spring of 1693. So this failed voyage of 1692, this had major financial repercussions for the colony. And those get passed down the line to Del Bayo himself and the senior crew of Santo Cristo. So you lost a bunch of money for the colony, and you are going to be paying for it.
The governor placed Del Bayo and other officials under obligation to repay the treasury for repairs to the ship and to pay securities before being allowed to leave port. Del Bayo, in order to avoid paying this bond, departed port abruptly, leaving behind both men and critical supplies.
I don't know long-term how this was supposed to work.
Yeah, like, is he just going to do one of those things where it's like, well, they're going to be so happy when I deliver this because they need it that they'll be okay with it.
Yeah, like it would have been delayed, like, you know, probably months or years, but ultimately, I don't know how this was supposed to work out for him.
I guess also, though, you figure, like, hey, they've got, like, 4 or 5 months to get over being mad at me. So, like, let's go.
So, in his haste to depart, it's estimated that more than 30 sailors were left behind, in addition to cargo that hadn't been loaded. So, standard crew for a Manila galleon was around 130 sailors. So, missing 30 of them, that's a significant percentage missing.
Yeah, I would imagine that, and that, you know, puts a lot more strain on the guys you do have. For you can't have as much rotation, like for shifts and stuff, and fewer people on each shift. So, like, everyone has to do a little more work. You
know, obviously, the officers and such, these are all going to be Spaniards, but a lot of the crew, the sailors, the hands, a lot of these are either from Mexico. You know, they could have been Spaniards born in Mexico. Some of them are from the Philippines. Some of them are native to the Philippines, or a mix of various elements of those.
And kind of like I think we had talked about in one of the previous episodes, if you're born in New Spain or the Philippines, like, you're Spanish, but like you're not the same as like someone born in Spain necessarily, right?
In like New Spain, for example, that was the Criollo class of people who, you know, even if both of your parents were Spanish, if you were born in Mexico, you immediately lost a kind of a level of status because you weren't truly a Spaniard.
Yeah, it's like when you go to Walmart and they got like the better, good, and the great option. Like, you're the good. Like, you're better than the better, but you're not the best.
You know, sailing would have been a job opportunity for a lot of those types. 30 out of 130. So you're missing like a little under a quarter of your expected crew. That's probably going to have an effect later if the vessel encounters rough weather and, you know, needs all hands on deck.
Or if a Dracula gets loose.
It's less food for the Dracula.
I love calling it the Dracula.
That's the best thing, is treating Dracula as a common noun is the best thing that this movie has done for Twitter.
Your tweet about the dang Dracula being loose. I read that like Boom Hour.
Dang old Dracula, man. So in regard to the cargo on board, typical items would have been porcelain ware, pottery, kind of all the fancy stuff you might expect to come from, you know, East Asia. Something that might be unexpected, beeswax.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Beeswax was in high demand for various uses, but the most interesting was its use in Mexico and elsewhere in Spain's territories for the making of candles. If you are a Catholic world power, you're going to go through a lot of candles.
They do like some candles.
So yeah, that's what these were needed for.
Were they unaware of slaughtering whales the way that like everyone else did that?
Probably at this point. So that particular cargo, as we've alluded to, will end up being really significant in establishing the fate of the Santo Cristo de Burgos. So as we've established, the Manila galleon trade was pretty highly codified and regulated practice. The Spanish, they had more than a century. They had a long time to figure out best practices of what they wanted to do here. That being the case, there's a strict set of rules that galleons were to follow, some of which were:
the crew and passengers must confess their sins in all honesty. Mass and prayers will be celebrated every afternoon.
The ship is to set sail in good condition with sufficient seamen and artillery to defend itself against the enemy.
If enemies are encountered, one must calculate how the ship must be defended, so as to free itself from danger. The nighttime navigation route should be changed to then return to the official route of the journey. If this is not possible, the ship is to be defended to the very end.
The ship is not to put into port unless absolutely necessary, and if so, in the Philippines, not in Japan. This must be done observing the safety of the ship and the cargo on board.
It is not permitted to fire any artillery, either on arriving or setting sail from port, for military or religious salutes, nor any superfluous reasons. The artillery is only to be fired during an encounter with the enemy.
During the journey, the soldiers must check their arms and pass review each day. It is not permitted to play cards or any other type of game because this is prohibited on board.
There is a strong, there will be no leaning on this shift, energy here. How dare you be comfortable and work?
Well, and it's similar to what you read about with the preparations for the Armada. I mean, again, very little has changed in that time period. When the Armada was in La Coruña, before they set sail, they had a mass confession where they had sailors and troops being ferried out to this island where you had like a team of priests on this island who were just going through these confessions just one after the other so they could get the whole Armada, confessed and ready to go. This would be like ideal for Mark Wahlberg's his app, to stay prayed up. This would have been perfect for the Armada.
It's just interesting seeing the difference between England, who has like such a naval tradition and like esprit de corps for the Navy. Whereas this is very much, you can just tell they're only doing this because they have to. Like if they, like the contempt that Spain kind of has for its naval forces and stuff. Like it's just interesting seeing the difference. To
an extent, it's almost like, you can kind of tell sometimes with certain jobs, and teaching is one for me where you can kind of tell how confident someone is by how like militant they have to be about stuff. And kind of the more visibly you have to be in control as a teacher, the less effective you typically are, because you might not be confident in your teaching. And so here it's just funny reading this whole list of rules, and I'm sure lots of people have lists of rules at the time, but it's just funny what some of the rules are. Saying, well, you can't not just no gambling, no games at all.
Yeah, like it just feels like any bit of joy has been stripped away from this. Whereas like, I'm sure it's not fun being in the British Navy, but like there's traditions and things that allow you to like blow off some steam and maybe play some cards.
And it's like you have to assume also that these rules probably only apply to the crew. Like, the officers are doing stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a selective enforcement. It's just like, it's just very Catholic. It honestly,
yeah,
there will be no joy here.
So yeah, I mean, those are not new regulations. They're very typical of what we would expect here. Also, similar admonitions against putting into port for any reason. We saw that with the Armada of saying, no, absolutely not. I don't care what happens. You are going to your destination and that's it. So that, the ship set sail off into the broad Pacific. In the days before long distance communication, really the only way of knowing something had happened to a galleon was if it didn't arrive in Acapulco. And as we said, you could be waiting for a long time before you could be really confident that it wasn't going to show up. And so, yeah, it does take a while before people realize that Santo Cristo de Burgos is not coming. A contemporary chronicler writing about the ship noted,
"It not only failed to reach port, but was wrecked, without our gaining the least knowledge of the place where that occurred. Careful search was made for many years along the coasts of South America and in other regions, but not the least news of the ship had been received."
So as late as 1699, it's still being mentioned by Spanish officials that they don't know anything about what happened to the ship. This happened occasionally with these galleons, but a lot of them happened in a way that could be recorded. Maybe they caught fire. The Marianas Islands was kind of a stopover point. They were able to figure out where these things ended up.
I would think at a certain point you'd have stories of someone, being like, "Oh, hey, we saw a ship on fire that night," but by the time we got there, like it was gone or something. Like there would be reports and sightings or something.
And that was one explanation of what happened to the Santo Cristo de Burgos, that she had caught on fire and burned in the Marianas Islands. But all of the modern sources that put forth that explanation, they all come back to a single source, William Schertz, who wrote a book about Spanish galleons in 1939. And this is kind of that historical game of telephone where that's not something that Schertz made up, but his explanation is in turn based on purely speculative mentions from the the more contemporary records. But that's always just mentioned as, well, this could have happened. Yeah, one possible explanation, it caught on fire. The overwhelming sense from the contemporary records is that no one has any idea. No one has any clue or hint of what happened to this wreck. It does essentially just disappear. And that mystery of what happened to the Santo Cristo de Burgos continued until relatively recently. So part 2 of this story is going to take us to the Pacific Northwest of the United States, the coast of Oregon, and a vessel historically referred to as the Beeswax Wreck. And we have a very special guest that we'll be talking to. That's Craig Andes, who discovered timbers from the wreck. And he's been really integral to establishing the identity of the wreck as the Santo Cristo de Burgos. Craig is a local to the area with long-term connections with the wreck and hands-on experience with artifacts from the site. So we're really looking forward to speaking with him next week so he can share his story. I had a pretty lengthy phone conversation with Craig yesterday. And just the stuff he has to share and the stuff that, we can kind of talk about is really amazing. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the part 2 of our episode here.
Yeah, absolutely. We really haven't had too many stories where we've got to talk to someone who's like actively involved in the story. So that's pretty cool.
So we're going to wrap the story for this week here. We've already kind of got a lengthy episode. And so, yeah, we will kind of talk about some of the aftermath of, what did happen to this vessel. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on also with after the wreck itself happens and, what happens with the crew, and kind of the continuing story of this Manila galleon. So, yeah, we'll end things there, and we will be talking to you next week again with the conclusion of a very special episode. Take care, everyone.